Okay, so this is the first day, May 15th, the Miles City Flood Awareness Day. We'll start off with Tracy Sears from DNRC on how to construct a structure in compliance with floodplain regulations, how the NFIP and FEMA affect our community with compliant, non-compliant structures, and how the community rating system helps our community. Tracy, all yours.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this meeting. And sorry, let me try to get set up here. Wanted to just kind of give just a brief overview. I know I have about 30 minutes to talk about constructing in the special flood hazard area. Miles City actually is one of 137 communities within the state of Montana that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. And most folks are pretty aware in Miles City of what that entails. I know the city does a great job of outreach, but I did want to touch, as the mayor mentioned, I did want to touch a little bit on how to construct in these areas, and then also maybe some helpful tools to help everyone as you're looking at maybe trying to do some sort of development if you have property that's in that special flood hazard area, and then how the community of Miles City's participation in the community rating system, how that helps all the property owners as well. So let me, I'm going to turn off my video so I can just concentrate on the slides here. But one of the things that we put together just a few years ago was this quick guide for Montana, and we actually do have these. We actually do have hard copies of these now too, but you can always go on to our website. I'm just going to show really quick. If you actually, the easiest way to get there, if you type in Montana floodplain. If you pull up Montana, it'll pull up our state site. And this website is for property owners, it's for communities. And on there is a button for permitting and regulations. And if you click on that, you can actually pull up, you should be able to pull up our guide. This is, we did have a little picture here, but if you pull up our guide here, what it does is it helps kind of understand what the regulations are. And so Miles City actually has their own floodplain regulations, just like all the other communities that participate in the program. But what's nice about this guide is it really kind of gives you some illustrations. It gives you background on the floodplain, why it's being regulated, but it also, if you're looking at very specific information, not to make everybody sick as I scroll through this, but if you're looking at maybe, hey, we want to do, we don't think our property is in that special flood hazard area, what are things that we can do to maybe petition to say, hey, we have better information, we want to see about getting out, or if they want to look at adding on to their structure, this document has all of this information with some illustrations. I'm trying to get to the ones where we're dealing with how to build. And so if you're looking at enclosures below the lowest floor, so all these building components that you see in the ordinance for Miles City, and you're asking like, hey, what does that look like? I think I understand it, but I want more information. This guide should help you out. And I will, what I'll do right now for everyone too, is I'm going to go ahead and drop in the chat, I'll drop the link to this so that if anybody is participating and they want to get that link, and we'll make sure that the city has it as well. You can just look up this document and take a look at these features. And so as we get into the regulations here in just a moment, you know, the slides that I'll be presenting should help you, but this little quick guide is a really handy tool. So I really wanted to start off with that. And so hopefully you'll find it pretty useful as you're looking at trying to develop in these areas. So as I mentioned, Miles City is part of the 137 communities, because we had Browning in there, but they disincorporated just the last couple of years. They are also part of one of the 11 communities that participate in the community rating system. And what that means is communities that nationwide go above and beyond the minimum standards for the National Flood Insurance Program could get significant discounts for property owners if they have to purchase federal flood insurance. And there's a variety of things that they are requesting to kind of get recognized for. And the higher the rating under CRS, the more of a discount that the property owners will receive. And we'll get into that here in just a little bit, but that's what Miles City is participating in. So I just want to really quick give a brief overview on the history and then go into the regulations, because I think understanding that history, and I'll skip over some questions, but it really helps on understanding what we're looking at in its entirety, what the local community is trying to administer. So one of the big questions that always comes up when we're talking about the National Flood Program is how can the federal government reduce flood losses? Well, before the National Flood Insurance Program, what we did as a nation was look at different types of structures. We see a lot of these structures that are still around. Miles City actually has a series of levees. A lot of communities were built in areas so they can quickly access water. And with that, we understand that there is a concern that these areas are prone and are risky of having floods occur. And we know that a lot of these flood control structures, they work great. I mean, Miles City has been fairly successful in a lot of the flood events, just like a lot of communities have. Minot actually, they had an event that exceeded, in 2011, exceeded any of the projected, what you can traditionally hear as 100-year flood events. And of course, when it overtopped that levee, we can see that these flood control structures are good, but in some situations, you want to make sure that these areas that are high risk are protected, and that's where the regulations come in as well. But before 1969, before the implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program, what they saw nationwide was that development in these flood-prone areas continued to increase. And of course, disaster relief payouts for flood damages also increased, but the availability of flood insurance was non-existent. After 1929, there was not any private insurance that was carrying flood because it was too risky. And like we always say, these companies are private companies. They are in it to make money. If they're not making money, they're going to try to get out. And we're seeing that trend right now as well for private insurance companies. A lot of them are kind of backing out of flood insurance. So as a nation, we were trying to figure out how do we tackle this problem of flooding. And there was a lot of discussion that went on for decades to figure out how do we tackle this. And that's where the National Flood Insurance Program kind of evolved. They knew that there needed to be something that had to be done about our flooding problem. And they said, look, we need to come up with a program. And when it was first proposed, it wasn't just it didn't have just insurance in it. It was called the Unified Floodplain Program. And what they were targeting are all these different components that would help reduce damage and reduce losses from flooding. And that's where, that's the basis of this National Flood Insurance Program. And really, we always talk about this is the National Flood Insurance Program. It really is an agreement between the local community and the federal government. And mainly what that agreement is, the federal government not only will provide flood insurance and make it available within a community, but it'll also help out with disaster assistance as well. And it relies on that local community to not only join the NFIP, but they also have to adopt and enforce floodplain regulations that meet the FEMA requirements, but also if the state has higher standards, such as Montana, they also have to do that as well. I'll try to be really careful on the time here. FEMA administers NFIP. The state acts as a liaison between that local community and FEMA. The state actually helps with regulations and with questions that come in, especially at the local level. So we try to help coordinate and provide training to that local floodplain administrator. Home insurance, as we know, does not cover flooding. That's a separate policy. And homes in the floodplain are required to get flood insurance. It's only if they have a federally backed mortgage and the home is in a high risk floodplain. A lot of property owners too sometimes can provide additional information and show that maybe their home is above that base flood elevation. But it is really dependent on your lender, and they could require flood insurance at any time. There are things that we hear. A lot of people have that misconception that they've lived there a long time, they've never seen any flooding. It goes back to the program's terminology of saying that special flood hazard area is that area that has been identified as being in what they call the 100-year flood, but really it's a 1% chance annually that a flood event can occur. So that's a little bit of that terminology. It causes some confusion. So they're thinking, we've been here 60 years. We had a flood maybe 20 years ago, so we're good for another 80. And that's hard for folks to kind of understand. We do see a lot of flood hazards around the state, whether it's ice jams or post-fire floods. And a lot of people think that maybe they can't do anything, probably because it's in the 100-year floodplain. There are some restrictions in the floodway, but mainly when it comes down to being able to do development in these areas that have been designated as high risk or in that special flood hazard area, they typically will follow the regulations at the local level. And it's not that they can't do development, but they may have to do it differently. And that's the big key there. And that's what we want to kind of talk about. The other thing that we try to bring up too is that we hear a lot of people say, well, it's my property, I'm willing to accept this risk. Understand, and again, these are all really important to understand why these regulations were kind of put together the way that they were. But the lifespan of a residential structure is about 170 years. So that's not just one owner, that's multiple owners that could be impacted when somebody is trying to build in these areas. So again, it's not that they can't build, they may just have to build a little bit differently. And the basis of a lot of regulation is no adverse impact. And what that means is that somebody does something on their property, they shouldn't have the right to adversely impact an adjacent property owner or somebody downstream or the community in that manner. So when they're looking at floodplain applications that come in at the local level, that's one of the things that they're looking at. How is this proposed project going to impact my neighbors? How's it going to impact property that they're looking at doing the development on? All these things are kind of reviewed, and that's all incorporated into those local regulations. So let's get into those regulations really quickly here. As we mentioned, in order to participate, the local community must meet or exceed the federal and state regulations. The federal regulations are in the Code of Federal Regulations. So a lot of the stuff that you'll see in Miles City regulations, they may have a reference to that Code of Federal Regulations or to the state regulations as well. And the regulations are really tied to what level of mapping that is within the community or in that area. So for Miles City, most of the area actually has detailed mapping, and it shows a floodway, and there's regulations that are specific to anything that's being done in the floodway, and there's areas that are in the flood fringe, and those have different levels of sections and stuff. We'll touch on them a little bit, but it's really important to understand if you're looking at developing on your property or on a piece of property, know exactly where that is sitting in that special flood hazard area, or if it's completely outside of it. And this is kind of some of that help that you can get from your local floodplain administrator, Sam Malinowski, or that office, or the office that she works in as well. And they should be able to help you with kind of knowing exactly where you're located, and that can really tell you what you can and can't do, or how you might have to build differently in that location. So as we mentioned, that special flood hazard area, it's also known as that 100-year floodplain, but it is at 1% chance of flooding any given year. And the point where it's also that point where the base flood elevation intersects the ground. So you might hear, what is in for my property, what's that base flood elevation? That's where all of your proposed development, if you're submitting a floodplain application, when you look at what you're proposing to do, a lot of things that they're going to look at is, okay, if you're looking at building a building, what is that base flood elevation surrounding that building, or that proposed building? Those are going to be the key on how high you might have to build that first floor, and what you can do on that property too. So as I mentioned before, some of the things that application should be looking at are what type of encroachments are occurring, and what's that impact going to be throughout that special flood hazard area. Some of the state standards are a little bit higher, include that 2 foot of freeboard. And I know if you've done work in Miles City, you've probably heard that 2 feet of elevation. I will say the minimum standard or the higher standards that they consider in Montana were actually the minimum standards that were proposed when this program was first introduced to Congress. So the 2 foot of freeboard, the 1/2 foot of floodway we'll get into, all of those items were actually ones that were part of that unified floodplain program in the very beginning. Now FEMA is in the process of updating their regulations, and the one thing that they are stressing and has been brought up on numerous comments has been freeboard. And so we are likely going to be seeing in the next year or two a freeboard requirement at the federal level. Whether it's 2 feet or 1 foot, we just won't know until they've completed their review. And what does that freeboard look like? It looks a little bit like this. If you have a structure that's being built on natural ground, you can see that there's the top picture here shows it's just being built. Let's just say that's a slab on grade. There's no freeboard. We see in the state more and more freeboard where people are actually elevating on posts and piers. That is something new in our state. We didn't typically ever see that. What we usually saw is either somebody doing it on a crawl space or on this bottom picture where they elevated on fill. It's hard to elevate on fill and not show an adverse impact in the municipality. The counties, since property owners have a little bit more room in the counties, sometimes are on 1 or 2 acres, but in the municipalities, it's just a little bit different. And as I've been saying before, it's not that you can't build, just that you might have to build differently. And with that freeboard, we see a lot of homes around the nation that are actually after events, or if they're looking at trying to reduce some of their flood insurance premium costs, we're seeing a lot of structures being elevated. This is something that's become kind of common practice now. And you can see there's just a little variation as to what those structures would look like. So as I mentioned, these are just some of the higher standards that we see in the state. The federal standards are kind of listed out with freeboard. The floodway encroachment, we probably won't touch a lot on that. But as far as structures being allowed in the floodway, on the federal standard, they still have to meet regulations, but in Montana, they are prohibited. That's because Montana, again, they adopted those minimum standards that were proposed in the very beginning because they knew that in that floodway area, you could see deeper depths and higher velocities. And so that was an area of concern. I know Miles City has that island that's adjacent to Yellowstone got kind of mapped in that floodway. So that's a little bit funky. Usually you can clearly see on that floodway, it's kind of where usually what we would see, like an area that would be in the floodway, is kind of where your slough is in that area down in Miles City. But any area that is designated floodway, again, there's restrictions, and those are the state regulations, and Miles City had to adopt those state regulations as well. And again, we are probably going to see these minimum standards come up federally as well, because these are the things that they're pushing for. And there's also some information about mobile homes. Again, on the federal standard, they can be elevated 3 feet above adjacent grade. They are also looking nationally on mobile homes to actually do the same thing that we have here. They're going to require them to be elevated to that freeboard protection level. And a lot of states and communities require that as well. Now, septic systems, that's a separate one that we see under environmental health in most communities. And for Miles City, you guys are on municipal water and sewer, so it's not really a big deal. But for those property owners out in the county, what they would see is in subdivisions, they're going to need to be located. The systems have to be located beyond, their drain fields have to be located 100 feet beyond the floodplain. So those are just a few things. And I will say these last flood events that we saw in June, we saw significant reduction. Most of the structures that were impacted were almost 65% of them were ones that were built prior to any mapping or regulations that had gone in. We do get some of these questions here, you know, when someone asks, hey, we do have an existing home. Can we build in a zone A, or in Miles City case, that flood fringe? And there are just a few things that are required. One, the floodplain permit would be required. And also, in addition, will need to be elevated 2 feet above that base flood elevation. You may, on here it says you may have to elevate the entire structure. And what happens on that is, if you're doing an addition on a structure, if you're doing a remodeling, anything that causes what we call a substantial improvement. So any improvement within a given year that will increase the value of that structure by more than 50%, it would trigger this substantial improvement regulation, which means the entire structure will have to be elevated. But the one piece of advice I would give everyone is, you've got a great floodplain administrator in Miles City. Give her a call her office. They'll be able to really talk you through some of these issues, especially on what you're trying to propose to do. So how to get out of these, I'm just going to go ahead and skip over this. In the floodplain permitting process, so any type of development, any man-made activity in a high-risk flood zone, it needs to go through the permitting process. And it's also required, if needed, any local, state, federal permits. Most of the stuff in Miles City is actually inland, so you're not worried about the Conservation District 310, but you'll still have to kind of check that off. And again, that Miles City floodplain administrator should be able to help you out there a lot. And there's also a guide to stream permitting in Montana that's helpful if you're looking at doing maybe bank stabilization or some type of repairs to kind of help you kind of get through this process. Miles City also has a lot of their applications online. Most communities use this joint applications. And then there's also a submittal requirements for floodplain permit applications that's super helpful, that you can get on Miles City's website, but you can also get it on DNRC website too. I know we're kind of running out of a little bit of time here, but this is just a little bit of what that joint application looks like. And again, a lot of this is tied to your map. So knowing the location of where you're going to be proposing that development, knowing what it's mapped as far as the floodplain is concerned, and making sure you kind of understand those regulations. Talk with the floodplain administrator. That's going to be your best bet. And as far as the CRS discounts and savings, I'm here to tell you, Miles City is one of our most progressive floodplain programs, and Sam has done a really good job on trying, and the community, because you have your PPI and putting on this great outreach program that you're doing this week. Miles City has been recognized as a Class 7 community in CRS. And with that building department, we're trying to actually get that pushed up a little bit more. And so we're hoping in the next couple of years, we'll actually be able to see that increase. But just what that can mean to property owners is that you can see up to about a 30% discount on your flood insurance. And that's, I'm sorry, you can see up to 15%, 20% discount on your flood insurance premium. And that's huge. And that's only going to increase as we see flood insurance premiums going to actuarial rates. We're only going to see hopefully an increase on some of these reductions on the premium based on what Miles City has put together as part of their excellent local floodplain program. And so with that, again, I apologize for jumping on late. And I guess if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer any at this time.
Are there any questions? Any questions? Well, Tracy, I guess we don't have any questions that I hear coming up, so thank you for your presentation.
Well, thank you. And I hope everyone has a good evening.
Thank you, you do.
Thank you.
All right, now we're waiting for